The bacon had barely finished spitting in the skillet when Graham Ellsworth threw back his head and laughed so hard he nearly knocked over his coffee cup. "A mail-order bride," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "Sam Whitfield, you are the biggest fool in Sweetwater Creek, and that is saying something considering we have got old Pete who talks to his mule like it understands English." Sam Whitfield, who owned the feed store 2 doors down from Graham's blacksmith shop, did not look amused. He set his fork down hard enough to rattle the plate. "Laugh all you want, Graham. My cousin over in Cheyenne did the same thing 2 years back, and now he has got himself a wife who cooks better than any woman in this territory and gives him 2 fine sons besides. A wife you buy through the mail like a seed catalog," Graham said, still chuckling, shaking his head at the absurdity of it. "You do not know the woman. You do not know her temperament, whether she snores, whether she has got a wicked tongue on her. You are marrying a photograph and a letter, Sam. That is not courting. That is gambling with your whole life." It was the spring of 1878, and Sweetwater Creek was the kind of town that existed because the railroad had decided it should, a scattering of clapboard buildings along a rutted main street in the Wyoming territory, surrounded by grassland that rolled out toward the Laramie Mountains like a great green sea. Graham's blacksmith shop sat at the edge of town, close enough to hear the trains when they came through, though that was not often. He had built the place himself 6 years earlier when he arrived with nothing but a set of tools inherited from his father, and a determination to make something of himself that did not depend on anyone's charity. At 29 years old, Graham Ellsworth was considered a fine catch by most of the unmarried women in the county, though he had shown no particular interest in any of them. He was broad through the shoulders from years of hammering iron, with dark hair that he kept cut short out of practicality rather than vanity, and a face that women called handsome and men called honest, which in Graham's experience amounted to the same thing. He had never married, not for lack of opportunities, but because he had watched his own parents' marriage curdle into something bitter and silent, and he had promised himself he would rather live alone than repeat their mistakes. "You mock what you do not understand," Sam said, gathering the last of his eggs onto his fork. "There is women out east, good women, decent women, who cannot find husbands because the war took so many men. They are not desperate, Graham, they are practical. Same as you when you decided to build a forge instead of waiting for one to fall out of the sky. That is different and you know it. Is it? You took a gamble on this town." "I am taking a gamble on a woman named Louisa who writes the finest letters I have ever read. We will see who comes out ahead." Graham could not argue with that, not entirely, though he tried for another few minutes before giving up and turning his attention back to his breakfast. The diner, run by a widow named Mrs. Prout who made the best coffee in 3 counties, was filling up with the usual morning crowd of ranch hands and shopkeepers, and the conversation moved on to the price of grain and whether the summer would bring drought again. But Graham kept turning the argument over in his mind even as he ate, because something about it needled at him in a way he could not quite name. It was not that he thought less of Sam for wanting a wife through correspondence. It was something else, some old wound he did not care to examine too closely, that made him scoff at the notion of love arranged like a business transaction, love that skipped the part where 2 people learned each other slowly, the way a river learns the shape of the land it cuts through. He finished his coffee, clapped Sam on the shoulder in a gesture that was as close to an apology as he was willing to give, and walked out into the bright morning to open up his shop. The day passed as most days did. A rancher named Elias Coburn brought in 2 horses that needed shoeing, and Graham worked the bellows and the anvil until sweat soaked through his shirt, the familiar rhythm of hammer against iron settling something restless in his chest the way it always did. He liked the honesty of the work, the way a piece of metal either held or it did not, the way there was no pretending or performing required, only skill and patience and the willingness to get it right. By midday he had finished the shoeing and started on a set of hinges for the new church building going up at the edge of town, a project the whole community had contributed to, Even Graham, who was not a particularly religious man, but believed a town needed a center, a place where people could gather and remember they were not alone in the world. He did not think again about mail-order brides or Sam Whitfield's foolish gamble until the noon stage came rattling into town in a cloud of dust, right on schedule, and something about the way the driver called out to the small crowd gathered near the stage office made Graham look up from his work. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked to the doorway of his shop, curious despite himself. The stagecoach from Cheyenne came through Sweetwater Creek twice a week, usually carrying mail, sometimes a passenger or two heading further west toward the mining towns, occasionally a salesman with a trunk full of patent medicines or sewing machines. It was not often that anyone of particular interest stepped off that stage, and Graham had learned not to expect much from it beyond the mail he was waiting on for a shipment of iron rod from Denver. But today was different. The door of the stagecoach opened, and a young woman stepped down onto the dusty street, and Graham found himself standing very still in the doorway of his shop, forgetting entirely about the hinges he had been working on. She was perhaps 24 years old, with hair the color of wheat gathered beneath a traveling bonnet that had clearly seen better days, and a traveling dress of gray wool that was dusty from the road but still neat, still pressed at the seams in a way that suggested she cared about appearances even after 3 days of hard travel. She carried a single carpet bag and a small trunk that the driver hefted down after her, and she stood on the boardwalk looking around at Sweetwater Creek with an expression that Graham could not quite read, something between determination and quiet terror, like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff deciding whether to jump. "Pardon me," she said to the stage driver, her voice carrying clearly across the street, "but could you direct me to the home of a Mr. Graham Ellsworth?" Graham felt his stomach drop straight through the floorboards. The driver, a grizzled man named Otis who had been running this route for as long as Graham had lived in Sweetwater Creek, scratched at his beard and pointed directly at Graham's shop. "That would be him right there, ma'am, standing in the doorway of his own smithy looking like he has seen a ghost." The young woman turned, and Graham found himself looking into a pair of gray eyes that held both hope and steel in equal measure, and his mouth went dry as summer dust. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, and there was a slight tremor in her voice that she was clearly working hard to control. "My name is Florence Redmond. I believe you have been expecting me." Graham had never been expecting anyone, least of all a mail-order bride he had mocked not 6 hours earlier over breakfast eggs, and he stood there for a long moment with his mouth open and no words coming out, while half the town, it seemed, gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. "Ma'am," Graham finally managed, "I believe there has been some manner of mistake." Florence Redmond's face went through several rapid changes, hope collapsing into confusion, and then into something that looked dangerously close to panic, though she held her chin high and her spine straight even as her gloved hands tightened around the strap of her carpet bag. "A mistake," she repeated. "You did not place an advertisement in the matrimonial news seeking a wife." "No, ma'am, I most certainly did not." A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered, and Graham became aware with rising horror that Sam Whitfield was standing among them, and that Sam's face had gone the color of a ripe tomato, caught somewhere between guilt and the desperate urge to laugh. "Sam," Graham said slowly, not taking his eyes off Florence Redmond, "is there something you would like to tell me?" Sam stepped forward, wringing his hat in his hands like a man about to confess to a much greater crime than the one he had actually committed. "Now, Graham, before you go getting angry, you have got to understand my intentions were good. You have been so all-fired lonely since you built that shop, working yourself to the bone, never courting anybody proper, and I thought if I placed an advertisement using your name, just to see what kind of response might come back, maybe you would meet somebody fine and decent, and it would shake you out of your bachelor stubbornness." "You placed an advertisement using my name," Graham said, "without telling me." "I was going to tell you. I was going to tell you before anybody wrote back. I did not think anybody would actually get on a stagecoach and come all this way. I figured we would trade a few letters first, get a feel for things, and then I would explain the situation to you gentle-like. Gentle-like, Graham repeated, and he could feel heat rising in his neck and face. Embarrassment and anger tangled together so tightly he could not separate one from the other. He turned back to Florence Redmond, who was watching this exchange with an expression of dawning, mortified understanding, her cheeks going pink beneath the dust of travel. "Miss Redmond," Graham said, trying to gather what dignity remained to him, "I am deeply sorry. This man is a fool, and I promise you he acted entirely without my knowledge or consent. I never advertised for a bride. I never wrote you any letters." "I received 3 letters," Florence said, her voice tight now, controlled in the way of someone holding back a great deal of feeling through sheer force of will. 3 letters signed with your name, describing your shop, your prospects, your character. I traveled 4 days by train and stagecoach from Ohio, Mr. Ellsworth, leaving behind everything I have ever known, based on the promise of those letters." The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the commotion, and Graham was acutely aware of every eye upon him, of the whispers already starting, of how this story would spread through Sweetwater Creek faster than a prairie fire. He looked at Sam, who had the decency to look thoroughly ashamed of himself, and then back at Florence Redmond, who stood on that dusty boardwalk with her small trunk and her carpet bag and her ruined expectations. 4 days from home with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. "Miss Redmond," Graham said, and something in him, some part that was not embarrassment or anger but plain human decency, rose up and steadied his voice. "I do not know what Sam wrote to you, and I am ashamed on his behalf for whatever falsehoods he might have spun, but I will not leave you standing in the street with nowhere to go. You have traveled a long way, and whatever the circumstances that brought you here, you deserve better than to be abandoned on a boardwalk in a town you have never seen." Florence's chin trembled slightly just once before she caught it and stilled it. "I do not need your charity, Mr. Ellsworth. If this was all some cruel joke played upon me, I will find my own way. It was not a joke played upon you by me, though I understand entirely why you might think so." Graham glanced at Sam, who seemed to be trying to sink into the ground and disappear. "Sam here will be paying for your return fare to Ohio if that is what you wish. Is that not right, Sam?" "Of course," Sam said quickly. "Of course, absolutely, whatever Miss Redmond needs." But Florence Redmond was quiet for a long moment, looking around at the town of Sweetwater Creek, at the wide dusty street, and the mountains rising blue and distant beyond the rooftops, at the faces of strangers watching her with a mixture of curiosity and pity that she clearly found unbearable. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, though Graham could see the effort it cost her. "I do not wish to return to Ohio," she said. "There is nothing for me there. That is precisely why I answered the advertisement in the first place." She looked at Graham directly then, and there was something fierce in her gray eyes that made him think she was not a woman easily broken by circumstance, however unjust. "I will find lodging here in town and employment of some kind, and I will make my own way, Mr. Ellsworth, without needing to be anybody's bride, mail-order or otherwise. I only ask that you not think too poorly of me for having believed those letters were genuine." Graham felt something shift in his chest, some combination of admiration and guilt that he did not have time to fully examine before Mrs. Prout, who had come out from the diner to see what all the commotion was about, stepped forward with her hands on her hips. "Well, I never," Mrs. Prout said, looking between Graham, Sam, and Florence with the sharp, assessing eye of a woman who missed nothing that happened in her town. "Sam Whitfield, you ought to be horsewhipped for pulling a stunt like this on a decent young lady. Miss Redmond, honey, you come on with me. I have got a room upstairs from the diner that I let out sometimes to travelers, and you will stay there tonight at no charge, and we will figure out the rest of this mess over supper, because there is no sense standing in the street arguing about it while your dinner gets cold and the whole town gawks at you like you were a traveling circus." Florence looked at Mrs. Pruitt with visible relief, some of the rigid tension leaving her shoulders. "Thank you," she said. "That is very kind. It is not kindness, it is common decency, which seems to be in short supply around certain feed store owners today." Mrs. Pruitt shot Sam a look that could have curdled milk, and Sam ducked his head and mumbled something about needing to get back to his store. Mrs. Pruitt took Florence's carpet bag from her hands despite Florence's protests, and began leading her toward the diner, and Graham stood in the doorway of his shop watching them go, feeling as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted in some fundamental way he did not yet understand. That evening, Graham found himself walking to the diner for supper, though he told himself it was only because he always took his supper there, and saw no reason to change his routine on account of the day's embarrassing events. The diner was busier than usual, word of the afternoon spectacle having spread through Sweetwater Creek with the efficiency of a telegraph wire, and several patrons glanced his way with poorly concealed curiosity as he took his usual seat at the counter. Florence Redmond was there, seated at a small table near the window, still wearing her traveling dress though she had removed the bonnet, and her wheat-colored hair was pulled back in a simple knot that suited her better than the elaborate styles Graham had seen on women who put more effort into their appearance than their character. She was eating a bowl of stew with the careful, deliberate manner of someone trying very hard to maintain composure in an unfamiliar and humiliating situation, and Graham found he could not stop glancing over at her, feeling the weight of an apology he had not yet properly delivered. He waited until Mrs. Pruitt had brought his own supper before he gathered the courage to move from his stool and cross the room to Florence's table. "Miss Redmond," he said, "would you mind terribly if I sat with you a moment? I feel I owe you a more proper explanation than what happened on the street this afternoon." Florence looked up at him, her gray eyes assessing, and for a moment Graham thought she might refuse him outright, which he supposed he deserved. But then she gestured to the empty chair across from her with a small, tired nod. "You may sit, Mr. Ellsworth, though I confess I have had quite enough humiliation for one day and would prefer not to relive it in detail." Graham sat, setting his plate down carefully, feeling more nervous than he had any right to feel considering he was the wronged party in this entire absurd situation, or at least one of them. "I want you to know," he said, "that I said some foolish things at breakfast this morning about mail-order brides being a fool's gamble, and I stand here now feeling like the greatest fool in the territory for having said them, considering how the day turned out. I do not know what Sam wrote to you in those letters, but whatever falsehoods they contained, they were not mine, and I am sorry beyond what words can properly express that you traveled so far only to be met with confusion and public embarrassment." Florence set down her spoon and studied him for a long moment, and Graham had the distinct sensation of being weighed and measured, though not unkindly. "May I ask what you find so foolish about the idea, Mr. Ellsworth? Since you have been so forthcoming about your opinions." Graham felt his face warm, but he did not look away from her steady gaze. "I suppose I thought it was foolish to build a marriage on letters alone, without knowing a person's true character, their temperament, the small things that make up a life together. I have seen marriages built on convenience curdle into misery, and I did not want that for my friend Sam, nor for myself, which is why I have avoided the whole business of courting entirely these past years." "And yet here you are," Florence said, a note of dry humor entering her voice despite everything, "having been engaged in a manner of speaking without your knowledge or consent to a woman you had never met, based entirely on letters you did not write." Graham could not help the small laugh that escaped him, surprised by it even as it happened. "Yes, I suppose that is rather the case, and rather ironic besides. I read those letters a dozen times, Mr. Ellsworth. I memorized passages of them. They spoke of a man who had built something from nothing, who valued honesty and hard work, who wanted a partner rather than a servant, who dreamed of a family filled with laughter rather than the cold silence he had grown up with. Florence's voice had gone quieter, more vulnerable, and Graham felt something twist painfully in his chest at her words, because whatever falsehood Sam had woven, that particular description had struck remarkably close to the truth of who Graham actually was. I do not know now whether any of it was true, or whether I simply built a fantasy in my own mind out of desperation to escape a situation that had become unbearable. What situation was that? Graham asked before he could stop himself, though he immediately worried he had overstepped. Florence was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her half-finished stew, and when she spoke again her voice had lost its earlier composure, revealing something rawer beneath. My father passed 2 years ago and left considerable debts that I did not know existed until after his death. My mother had died when I was young, so it fell to me to manage what remained, and I discovered that our home, the only home I had ever known, was mortgaged well beyond its worth. I lost it within the year. Since then I have lived first with an aunt who made it clear I was an unwelcome burden, and then in a boarding house working as a seamstress, barely earning enough to keep myself fed and clothed. When I saw the advertisement in the matrimonial news, describing a man who wanted a wife and a family and a fresh start in the Western Territories, it seemed like the answer to prayers I had nearly given up saying. Graham listened to this with a growing weight in his chest, understanding now the full measure of what Sam's thoughtless prank had cost this young woman, who had risked everything, her safety, her reputation, her remaining resources, on the strength of letters that had never truly come from him. "I am sorrier now than I was a moment ago," Graham said quietly. "You deserved better than what happened today, Miss Redmond, and I intend to see that Sam makes proper amends, and that you are not left stranded here through no fault of your own." "I do not want charity," Florence said again, though with less fire than before, more exhaustion. "I have had enough of feeling like a burden to people who did not ask for the responsibility of me. It would not be charity. Sweetwater Creek is a growing town, and there is always need for capable hands. Mrs. Prout mentioned you have skills as a seamstress. The dry goods store has been wanting someone to help with alterations and mending for townsfolk who cannot manage such things themselves. It is honest work, and it would allow you to support yourself while you decide what you truly wish to do." Florence looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with wariness, as though she had learned through hard experience not to trust kindness too easily. "Why would you concern yourself with my situation, Mr. Ellsworth? You owe me nothing beyond the apology you have already given." Graham considered the question seriously before answering, because he found he did not entirely know the answer himself, only that something about this woman's quiet strength in the face of humiliation and hardship had struck a chord in him that he had not expected. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "because a man ought to try to fix the messes made in his name, even unknowingly, and perhaps because you traveled a very long way based on a belief in a man's character, and even though that man did not write those letters, I would like to think I could still live up to some part of what was described in them." Florence's gray eyes held his for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her face, and then she gave a small nod. "I will consider the position at the dry goods store, Mr. Ellsworth. Thank you for the suggestion." "Please," Graham said, "call me Graham. Considering the circumstances, I think we are past the point of excessive formality." A small, reluctant smile touched the corner of Florence's mouth, the first he had seen from her since she stepped off the stage. "Then you may call me Florence, Graham, though I make no promises about forgiving Mr. Whitfield any time soon. I would not ask you to. I have not decided myself whether I have forgiven him." They finished their supper in a conversation that grew easier as the evening wore on, Florence describing her childhood in Ohio, the small pleasures of a life she had lost, the sewing skills her mother had taught her before she passed, and Graham found himself telling her about his own arrival in Sweetwater Creek 6 years earlier, about building his shop board by board with his own hands, about the loneliness he had never quite admitted to himself, until a stranger's arrival had thrown it into sharp relief. By the time Mrs. Prout came to clear their plates, the diner had emptied around them, and Graham realized with some surprise that hours had passed without his noticing, that he had not felt this easy in conversation with anyone in longer than he cared to admit. The following morning, Graham went first thing to Sam Whitfield's feed store, and the conversation that followed was not a pleasant one, though it ended with Sam agreeing to pay for a month's lodging for Florence above the diner, in addition to covering any expenses she might incur while establishing herself in Sweetwater Creek, as penance for the trouble his foolishness had caused. Graham also made it clear, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that Sam was never to place another advertisement using anyone's name without their explicit knowledge and consent, a promise Sam gave readily, and with visible relief that Graham had not pursued the matter further, perhaps with his fists. Florence took the position at the dry goods store within the week, working alongside the owner's wife, Mrs. Halloran, mending and altering clothing for the townsfolk with a skill that quickly earned her a reputation as the finest seamstress in the county. She proved capable not only with needle and thread, but with the ledger books as well, having managed her father's failing finances long enough to understand the workings of commerce better than most, and Mrs. Halloran soon found herself relying on Florence for far more than simple mending. Graham found reasons to visit the dry goods store more frequently than his blacksmith business strictly required, purchasing nails he did not immediately need, ordering supplies a week before he actually needed them, all for the simple pleasure of exchanging a few words with Florence across the counter, watching the way sunlight caught the wheat gold of her hair when she bent over her sewing, the careful concentration in her gray eyes as she worked a needle through fabric with practiced precision. 3 weeks after her arrival, Florence had settled into a small routine that suited her, boarding permanently now in a room above the dry goods store that Mrs. Halloran let out for a fair price, spending her days sewing and keeping accounts, her evenings sometimes taking supper at the diner where she and Graham had fallen into a habit of sharing conversation over Mrs. Prout's cooking, though neither of them had yet named what was growing between them, content instead to let it unfold slowly, the way Graham had always believed love ought to grow, through accumulated moments rather than manufactured promises on paper. It was on a Sunday afternoon in early June, nearly a month after Florence's arrival, that Graham finally worked up the courage to ask her to accompany him on a walk along the creek that gave the town its name, a ribbon of clear water that ran through a stand of cottonwood trees at the edge of town, offering shade and privacy from the ever-watchful eyes of Sweetwater Creek's residents. "I have been meaning to ask you something," Graham said as they walked, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders, the creek murmuring beside them over smooth stones. "And I find myself more nervous than I have any right to be, considering I have known you nearly a month now." Florence glanced at him sideways, a small smile playing at her lips. "That sounds ominous, Graham. Should I be concerned?" "No, nothing like that." He took a breath, feeling suddenly like a much younger man, uncertain and clumsy with words in a way he had not been since adolescence. "I wanted to ask whether you have given any more thought to your future here in Sweetwater Creek. Whether you intend to stay permanently, or whether you still think of this as a temporary arrangement until something better presents itself." Florence stopped walking and turned to face him fully, her gray eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his heart beat faster. "Are you asking because you wish to know my plans, or because you have some particular interest in what those plans might include?" Graham found he could not look away from her, could not pretend any longer that his interest was merely practical curiosity. "I am asking, Florence, because these past weeks have been the finest of my life, and I find I do not wish to imagine a version of Sweetwater Creek that does not include you in it. I know the circumstances of your arrival were not what either of us intended. I know we did not begin this the way most courtships begin. but I have come to care for you deeply, and I would very much like the chance to court you properly, if you would allow it, not because of letters written in my name that I never wrote, but because of the woman I have come to know these past weeks, with her quick wit and her steady hands and her stubborn refusal to accept pity even when circumstance handed her every reason to expect it. Florence's eyes had grown bright, and she pressed her lips together for a moment before she trusted herself to speak. Graham Ellsworth, I traveled 4 days across half a country believing in a man who did not exist, only to find something far better waiting for me, though it took the shape of considerable embarrassment on a dusty street corner before I understood it. I would very much like to be courted properly, as you say, though I confess I have already spent a great deal of these past weeks caring for you, rather more than what might be considered proper for a woman in my position. Graham felt a grin spread across his face, wide and unguarded in a way that surprised him with its sincerity. Then perhaps we are both fools, Florence, having fallen for each other despite every sensible argument I made against exactly this sort of thing at breakfast a month ago. Perhaps, Florence agreed, laughing now, the sound of it bright and unrestrained in a way Graham had not yet heard from her, and something in his chest felt like it might burst from the sheer fullness of feeling that laughter stirred in him. Though I would remind you that you have already been proven wrong once about the merits of mail-order arrangements, so perhaps your judgment on such matters cannot be entirely trusted. I will happily be wrong about this for the rest of my days, Graham said, and reached for her hand, and Florence let him take it, her fingers threading through his with a naturalness that felt like coming home to a place he had not known he was searching for. They walked along the creek in comfortable silence after that, hand in hand, the afternoon light slanting gold through the cottonwood leaves, and Graham thought that whatever mockery he had made of Sam Whitfield's foolish scheme, whatever wounded pride had colored his words that morning at breakfast, he could not now regret a single moment of the chaos that had followed, for it had brought him to this creek, this afternoon, this woman whose hand fit so perfectly in his own. Their courtship, once properly begun, moved with the steady inevitability of a river finding its course toward the sea. Graham took to calling on Florence at the dry goods store in the evenings after his own work was finished, walking her back to her boarding room above the shop, their conversations ranging from the practical concerns of daily life in Sweetwater Creek to deeper matters of hope and memory, and the futures they each imagined for themselves. Florence told him more about her father, a good man undone by poor investments and an inability to admit his failing finances even to himself, and about her mother, gone too young from a fever when Florence was only 12, leaving her to grow up faster than most girls her age were required to. Graham, in turn, told her about his own parents, his father a hard-working farmer in Missouri, whose marriage to Graham's mother had soured over years of financial hardship and unspoken resentments, until the house Graham grew up in had felt less like a home and more like a battlefield where love had long since been driven out by bitterness. He told her he had left for the Western Territories at 19 partly to escape that atmosphere, and partly out of a genuine desire to build something entirely his own, something that could not be taken from him, the way circumstances had slowly taken everything from his parents. I think that is why I mocked the idea of a mail-order bride so readily, Graham admitted one evening in July, as they sat together on the small porch outside Mrs. Halloran's shop, watching the sun set behind the Laramie Mountains in streaks of orange and violet. It seemed to me like exactly the kind of arrangement that leads to the misery I watched my parents endure, a marriage built on practicality and convenience rather than genuine affection, doomed from the start to curdle into resentment. And yet here we sit, Florence said softly, having built exactly the kind of affection you feared could not grow from such circumstances, however accidentally we arrived at them. I think, Graham said, taking her hand in his, that what matters is not how a courtship begins, but how two people choose to tend it once it has taken root. My parents chose bitterness. I do not intend to make that same choice, Florence, not with you." It was in August, on a warm evening scented with the ripening wheat fields that surrounded Sweetwater Creek, that Graham asked Florence Redmond to marry him, not with letters written by another man's hand, but with words entirely his own, spoken beside the same creek where they had first admitted their affection for each other. He had saved for weeks to purchase a modest ring from the jeweler in Cheyenne, a simple band with a small garnet stone that had cost him nearly a month's earnings, but which he considered the finest investment he had ever made. "Florence Redmond," he said, kneeling on the grassy bank with the creek murmuring beside them and the last light of evening painting the sky in soft gold, "I know this is not how either of us imagined our story beginning, back when Sam's foolishness sent you halfway across the country to meet a man who had never written you a single word. But I believe some things are meant to find their way to us regardless of the path they take, and I believe you were meant to find your way to Sweetwater Creek, and to me, however winding and improbable that road turned out to be. I love you more than I have loved anything or anyone in my life, and I would consider myself the most fortunate man in the Wyoming territory if you would agree to be my wife." Florence's eyes filled with tears that she did not try to hide, and she sank down to her knees in the grass in front of him, taking his face in both her hands. "Graham Ellsworth, I came to this town believing in a man who did not exist, and I found instead a man far better than any letter could have described. Yes, I will marry you, and I will love you for the rest of my days, and I will thank Sam Whitfield's foolishness every single anniversary of our wedding for as long as we both shall live." They were married in October of 1878, in the small church that Graham had helped build with his own hands, the hinges he had forged that very first morning of Florence's arrival now hanging on the church doors themselves, a detail that Mrs. Prout pointed out to anyone who would listen as proof that some things were simply meant to be, however they came about. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, Sam Whitfield among them, having spent the better part of the summer trying to make amends for his role in bringing the two of them together, though by now most of Sweetwater Creek had forgiven him entirely, considering the outcome had turned out so happily despite his foolishness. Even Louisa, the woman Sam had originally corresponded with for his own mail-order courtship, had by then arrived in Sweetwater Creek herself, and the two of them stood together at Graham and Florence's wedding, their own courtship progressing steadily toward a wedding of their own that would follow within the year. Florence wore a dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself, using skills honed through years of necessity and hardship, the fine stitching a testament to the woman who had survived so much before finding her way to this small church at the edge of the Wyoming grasslands. Graham stood at the altar in his best suit, the same steady hands that had shaped iron into hinges and horseshoes now trembling slightly with an emotion he had never expected to feel so completely, as he watched Florence walk down the makeshift aisle toward him, escorted by Mrs. Prout, who had become something of a surrogate mother to her in the months since her arrival. The Reverend, a kind older man named Reverend Abel Cartwright, who had come to Sweetwater Creek from Kansas 2 years earlier to help establish the church, spoke of love that grows unexpectedly, in circumstances that seem at first to be mistakes, but reveal themselves in time to be exactly the path Providence intended. He spoke of the injustices that had brought Florence to this point, the loss of her family home, the callousness of relatives who had turned her away, the desperation that had driven her to answer an advertisement from a man she had never met. And he noted that such hardships, while never to be wished upon anyone, had a way of revealing character, of showing what a person was truly made of when circumstances stripped away every comfort and certainty. Florence Redmond arrived in this town with nothing but a carpet bag and a small trunk, Reverend Cartwright said to the gathered congregation, having been failed by a system that too often leaves women without recourse when tragedy strikes, without protection when relatives prove unkind, without the means to build a stable life on their own terms. That she found her way, through circumstances neither planned nor expected, to a man of genuine character, and to a community willing to embrace her, speaks not only to her own remarkable strength, but to the possibility that even our greatest hardships can lead us toward unexpected grace. Florence, listening to these words with tears streaming freely down her face, reached for Graham's hand and held it tightly, and Graham squeezed back, understanding fully now the weight of everything she had carried and overcome to arrive at this moment. When the Reverend finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause and cheering that seemed far too large for the modest building to contain, and Graham kissed his bride for the first time as her husband, feeling as though every hardship in his own life, every lonely year spent building his shop and avoiding the vulnerability of love, had been leading him toward this precise moment, this precise woman, standing before him with her whole heart visible in her tear-streaked, joyful face. They celebrated late into the evening with a supper prepared by half the women of Sweetwater Creek, tables set up outside the church and strung with lanterns as the October evening cooled around them. Fiddle music provided by a ranch hand named Cyrus, who was known throughout the county for his skill with the instrument. Graham danced with his new wife beneath the lantern light, feeling clumsy and joyful in equal measure, and thought that he had never in his life imagined feeling this complete, this certain that he had found exactly where he belonged. Sam Whitfield, somewhat in his cups from the celebration, cornered Graham near the edge of the gathering and clapped him heartily on the shoulder. "I told you," he said, grinning broadly. "I told you it would work out fine, did I not?" "You told me nothing of the sort," Graham said, laughing despite himself. "You mocked nothing, Sam, because you were the one making the fool arrangement in the first place. I was the one doing the mocking, if you recall, and rather thoroughly at breakfast that very morning." "Details," Sam said, waving a hand dismissively. "The point remains that I am responsible, in my own roundabout way, for the finest thing that has happened to you in all your years in this territory, and I expect to be properly thanked at every anniversary for the rest of your natural life." "I believe Florence already promised as much," Graham admitted, glancing over to where his new wife stood laughing with Mrs. Prout and Louisa, her face radiant in the lantern light, and he felt his heart swell with a gratitude so complete it nearly overwhelmed him. "Though I still maintain you deserved a proper thrashing for the manner in which you executed your scheme, however fortunate the outcome turned out to be." "A man takes his victories where he finds them," Sam said sagely, and wandered off to find more punch, leaving Graham to make his way back to his bride, who turned to him with a smile that promised a lifetime of exactly this kind of joy. The early months of their marriage passed in the steady rhythm of building a shared life, Florence continuing her work at the dry goods store while also taking in additional sewing commissions from the wider ranching community, her reputation for fine work spreading throughout the county, until she had more requests than she could easily manage. Graham expanded his own blacksmith business that winter, taking on an apprentice named Jedediah Marsh, a 16-year-old boy from a nearby ranch who showed genuine promise with the forge, and whose family could not afford to keep him idle at home when there was honest work to be learned in town. They built a small house together on a plot of land just outside Sweetwater Creek proper, close enough to Graham's shop that he could walk to work each morning, but far enough to have a bit of land for a garden and a few chickens, which Florence tended with the same careful attention she gave to everything in her life. Graham built the house himself over the course of that first winter and following spring, with help from several of the townsmen who had come to consider both Graham and Florence valued members of their community. And by the time the house was finished in April of 1879, it stood as a testament to exactly the kind of partnership Graham had once believed impossible to build from an arrangement as unlikely as theirs had been. It was in that house, in the autumn of 1879, that Florence told Graham she was carrying their first child, and Graham, who had spent his whole life believing himself perhaps too solitary a soul to ever build the kind of family he secretly longed for, found himself weeping with a joy he had never expected to feel so completely. He built a cradle himself that winter, using wood from a cottonwood tree that had fallen near the creek where he had first held Florence's hand, wanting some piece of that place, that beginning, to be part of whatever came next for their growing family. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Florence's father, was born in the spring of 1880, arriving during a fierce rainstorm that had the whole town holding its breath, worried that the midwife might not make it through the mud in time. But Thomas arrived healthy and squalling into the world just as the storm broke and sunlight came pouring through the parting clouds, and Graham held his son for the first time with hands that had grown steady shaping iron, but trembled now with an entirely different kind of strength required. The strength of holding something so precious and fragile and utterly dependent on his care. Florence recovered well from the birth, and within the year she was back to her sewing work, though she scaled back her hours to spend more time with young Thomas, who grew into a curious, sturdy toddler with his mother's wheat-colored hair and his father's steady dark eyes. Graham found himself changed by fatherhood in ways he had not anticipated, the hardness he had carried since his own difficult childhood softening, as he watched his son take his first steps across the floor of the home Graham had built, as he heard Thomas's first laughter echo through rooms that had once held only the silence of Graham's solitary bachelor life. 2 years after Thomas's arrival, in 1882, Florence gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace, born in the calm quiet of an early summer morning, so different from the storm that had accompanied her older brother's birth that Graham teased Florence about how their children's temperaments already seemed to match the weather of their arrivals. Thomas boisterous and energetic, Grace serene, and observant even from her earliest days. Sweetwater Creek itself grew alongside the Ellsworth family, the railroad expanding its presence in the territory, bringing more settlers, more commerce, more of the steady civilization that transforms a scattered collection of buildings into something resembling a true town. Graham's blacksmith business thrived as the population grew, and he eventually took on a second apprentice to help manage the increased demand, while Florence's reputation as a seamstress had grown so significant that she opened a small dress shop of her own in 1883, employing 2 other women from the town to help meet the demand for her services, a business that gave her both financial independence and the deep satisfaction of having built something entirely of her own making, much as Graham had built his forge years before. Sam Whitfield and Louisa married the year following Graham and Florence's own wedding, and the 2 couples remained close friends throughout the years that followed, their children growing up together, playing in the same creek where Graham had once proposed to Florence beneath the cottonwood trees. Sam never let an opportunity pass to remind Graham that he was, in his own roundabout fashion, responsible for the greatest happiness in Graham's life, and Graham, in time, stopped arguing the point too vigorously, understanding that whatever chaos and embarrassment Sam's foolish scheme had caused that first day, it had ultimately led him to exactly the life he had once believed himself too guarded, too wounded by his parents' example, to ever truly find. In the autumn of 1885, 7 years after that first fateful noon stage arrival, Graham and Florence celebrated their anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, their children Thomas and Grace, now 5 and 3 years old respectively, already sound asleep in the bedroom Graham had built for them with his own hands. Florence had prepared Graham's favorite meal, and after the dishes had been cleared, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the last light of an October evening fade behind the Laramie Mountains, much as it had faded on the evening Graham had proposed beside the creek. "Do you remember," Florence said softly, resting her head against Graham's shoulder as they sat together in the cooling evening air, "what you said to Sam that morning at breakfast, about mail-order brides being a fool's gamble?" Graham laughed quietly, wrapping his arm around his wife and pulling her closer against him. I remember thinking myself very wise indeed, laying out all the reasons why such an arrangement could never lead to genuine happiness. "And here we sit," Florence said, "7 years and 2 children into precisely the kind of happiness you claimed was impossible." "I have never been more grateful to be proven a fool in all my life," Graham said, and turned to kiss his wife gently in the fading light. "Though I maintain that what we built was not the arrangement I mocked that morning, not truly. Sam's scheme brought you here, yes, and for that I will always be grateful to him despite his foolishness. But what grew between us after that, Florence, that was not manufactured by letters or arrangements. That was built the slow way, the true way, through every evening we spent talking on Mrs. Halloran's porch, every walk beside the creek, every hardship and joy we have shared since. That is a different thing entirely from what I mocked that morning, and I think perhaps that is the lesson in all of it, that love cannot be arranged or purchased or guaranteed by any letter, no matter how finely written. It has to be built, patient hammer stroke by patient hammer stroke, the same way I built this house, the same way I shape iron into something useful and lasting." Florence smiled against his shoulder, her hand finding his in the darkness. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever compared our marriage to, Graham Ellsworth, a blacksmith's forge." "I am a simple man," Graham said, laughing. "I speak in the language I know best, but I mean it entirely, Florence. Every day with you has felt like something worth building, worth tending, worth strengthening against whatever hardships come our way. I would not trade a single moment of it, not even the humiliating parts, not even the argument I had with Sam that started this whole improbable chain of events." They sat together on that porch until the stars came out fully overhead, the vast Wyoming sky stretching endless and brilliant above the small town that had become home to both of them in ways neither could have predicted that first morning, when Graham had mocked an idea that would, within hours, walk directly into his life and change it forever. The years that followed brought their own share of both joys and hardships, as all lives eventually do. In 1887, a harsh winter tested the resilience of the whole Sweetwater Creek community, with heavy snows cutting off supply routes for weeks at a time, and Graham found himself working long hours at his forge repairing tools and equipment that ranchers desperately needed to keep their livestock alive through the brutal cold. Florence, meanwhile, organized the women of the town to pool resources and share provisions among families running low on supplies, her own experience with hardship and scarcity giving her both the practical knowledge and the compassionate understanding needed to ensure no family in Sweetwater Creek went without through the worst of that winter. It was during this same difficult winter that Florence gave birth to their third child, a son they named Peter, born during a brief lull in the snowstorms that allowed the midwife to reach their home in time, though the labor had been difficult and left Florence weakened for several weeks afterward. Graham nursed his wife back to health with the same patient devotion he brought to every aspect of their marriage, and by spring, Florence had recovered fully, and Peter had grown into a healthy, if somewhat colicky, infant who kept the whole household awake with his considerable lung capacity most nights that first year. The town itself continued to grow and change through these years, the railroad bringing not just settlers, but also, inevitably, some of the lawlessness that plagued many territories during this period of Western expansion. In 1889, a group of cattle rustlers operating in the region attempted to make off with a portion of Elias Coburn's herd, and the resulting confrontation, while thankfully resolved without serious violence, reminded the whole community of the ever-present dangers that came with frontier life. Graham, along with several other townsmen, had ridden out with the local sheriff to help track down the rustlers, and though the experience had been frightening, particularly for Florence, who waited anxiously at home with their 3 children until Graham returned safely 2 days later, It had also reinforced within Graham a deeper appreciation for the fragile peace and prosperity they had managed to build in Sweetwater Creek, a peace worth protecting and defending when necessary. "I do not know what I would have done," Florence told him that night, after the children had finally been settled to sleep and she had spent nearly an hour simply holding on to Graham, reassuring herself of his safe return. "If something had happened to you out there, Graham, I cannot imagine this life, this family, without you at the center of it." "Nothing happened," Graham said gently, stroking her hair as she rested against his chest. "I am here, and I intend to remain here for a great many years yet, watching our children grow, growing old myself beside you on this very porch." "You had better," Florence said, with mock severity that could not quite hide the genuine fear that had gripped her during his absence. "I did not travel 4 days across half the country to be widowed by cattle rustlers in the Wyoming territory, Graham Ellsworth." Graham laughed softly at this, pulling her closer. "No, I suppose that would be a rather unsatisfying end to our story, considering how improbably it began." By 1890, 12 years after Florence's arrival on that fateful noon stage, the Ellsworth family had become one of the most respected in Sweetwater Creek, Graham's blacksmith business having expanded to include a small foundry operation that supplied hardware to ranches throughout the county, while Florence's dress shop had grown into the finest establishment of its kind in the region, drawing customers from as far as Cheyenne who had heard of her exceptional skill with fabric and needle. Their children, Thomas, now 10 years old, Grace 8, and Peter 3, filled their home with exactly the kind of laughter and chaos that Graham had once believed himself too damaged by his own childhood to ever properly enjoy, but which he now could not imagine his life without. Sam Whitfield and Louisa, meanwhile, had welcomed 4 children of their own into their family, and the two households remained as close as ever, gathering frequently for shared meals and celebrations. The children of both families, growing up together much like their parents, had built their own friendship through years of shared history and mutual affection. On the 12th anniversary of Florence's arrival, the two families gathered together for a celebration that had, by unspoken tradition, become an annual event in Sweetwater Creek, a day when the whole town remembered the improbable beginning of the Ellsworth marriage and celebrated how thoroughly it had blossomed despite, or perhaps because of, its unconventional start. Reverend Cartwright, older now but still serving the community with the same gentle wisdom he had brought to Graham and Florence's wedding 12 years earlier, spoke briefly at this gathering, as he did each year, about the strange and mysterious ways that Providence sometimes worked, bringing people together through circumstances that seemed at first like mistakes or misfortunes, but which time revealed to be exactly the paths meant to lead toward the greatest happiness. "I have married a great many couples in my years serving this community," Reverend Cartwright said to the gathered friends and family, "but I do not believe I have ever witnessed a love story that began quite so inauspiciously, nor one that grew into quite so solid and enduring a foundation." Graham Ellsworth mocked the very idea of a mail-order bride at his breakfast table one morning, and by supper that same evening, he had met the woman who would become the great love of his life. I think there is something instructive in that, something about how quick we are to judge circumstances we do not fully understand, and how often the universe delights in proving our certainties wrong in the most wonderful of ways. Graham, standing beside Florence with young Peter perched on his shoulders and Thomas and Grace nearby playing with the Whitfield children, found himself thinking back to that morning 12 years earlier, to his own laughing dismissal of Sam's foolish scheme, to the certainty he had felt that love could not be arranged, could not arrive on a stagecoach schedule, could not be anything other than the slow accumulation of shared history between two people who had known each other properly before committing their lives together. He had been wrong about so much of that, he realized now, watching his wife laugh at something Louisa had said, her wheat-colored hair now showing the first few threads of gray, her face lined with the marks of 12 years of joy and hardship both, but no less beautiful to him than she had been that first afternoon when she stepped off the noon stage in her dusty traveling dress. Her chin held high despite the humiliation of discovering the letters she had traveled so far to answer had never truly been written by the man standing before her. He had been right about one thing, though, he thought, watching his family and friends gathered together in the golden light of a Wyoming autumn afternoon. Love could not simply be manufactured through an advertisement or arranged through correspondence between strangers who had never met. What he had failed to understand that morning was that the arrangement itself was never truly what mattered. What mattered was what two people chose to build once circumstance, however improbable or accidental, had brought them together. Florence had not fallen in love with a stranger's letters. She had fallen in love with the man Graham actually was, discovered slowly through months of shared conversation and growing trust, built the true way, the hard way, the way that lasted. "What are you thinking about?" Florence asked, coming to stand beside him as Peter climbed down from Graham's shoulders to chase after his siblings and the Whitfield children across the golden grass. "I was thinking," Graham said, wrapping his arm around her waist and pulling her close against his side, "about how grateful I am that Sam Whitfield is such a meddling fool." Florence laughed, the sound of it as bright and full as it had been that first afternoon beside the creek when he had asked her to let him court her properly. "I believe that is the kindest thing you have ever said about him. He deserves it, I suppose, however much trouble his scheme caused that first day." Graham looked down at his wife, at the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 12 years earlier believing in a fiction written by another man's hand, only to discover something far more real and lasting waiting for her in the town of Sweetwater Creek. "I mocked the idea of a mail-order bride that morning, Florence, because I did not believe love could be built on such uncertain foundations. But I was not accounting for the possibility that fate might simply use that foolish arrangement as an excuse to bring exactly the right person into my life, regardless of how improperly the introduction was made." "And are you glad it did?" Florence asked, though her smile told him she already knew the answer. "I'm the most grateful man in the Wyoming Territory," Graham said, and kissed his wife beneath the golden autumn sky, surrounded by their children and friends, in the town that had become home to them both, 12 years after a foolish scheme and a noon stage had brought them together in ways neither could have predicted, but which had led, through patient hammer strokes and careful stitches, through hardship weathered together and joy multiplied by sharing it, to exactly the kind of love Graham had once believed impossible, and which he now understood to be the truest and most lasting foundation of his entire life. Their family continued to grow and flourish in the years that followed. Thomas, showing an early aptitude for his father's trade, began apprenticing at Graham's forge at the age of 14, eventually taking over management of the growing blacksmith and foundry business by the time he reached his early 20s, allowing Graham to slow his own pace of work while still remaining active in the business that had been his first foundation in Sweetwater Creek. Grace inherited her mother's skill with needle and fabric, working alongside Florence in the dress shop through her teenage years before eventually marrying a young rancher named Daniel Foster in 1900, at the age of 18, in a wedding that mirrored many of the same traditions established at her parents' own ceremony 22 years earlier, held in the same small church, officiated by an aging but still spirited Reverend Cartwright. Peter, the youngest, showed less interest in either blacksmithing or sewing, instead developing a passion for horses that led him eventually to establish his own successful ranch on land purchased from Elias Coburn's growing estate, breeding and training horses that became known throughout the territory for their quality and temperament. He married a young woman named Rebecca Hayes in 1905, the daughter of a family that had settled in Sweetwater Creek during the town's continued growth through the final decades of the century. And their wedding, like his siblings before it, took place in the church that had become the true heart of the community Graham and Florence had helped build from its earliest days. Graham and Florence Ellsworth grew old together in the house Graham had built with his own hands in the winter following their wedding, watching Sweetwater Creek transform from a scattered collection of buildings along a rutted main street into a proper town with its own newspaper, its own bank, its own school where their grandchildren would eventually learn to read and write and do their sums, much as Thomas, Grace, and Peter had learned in the smaller schoolhouse of their own childhood. Through it all, through the joys of watching their children marry and start families of their own, through the harder years of drought and hardship that occasionally tested the whole community's resilience, through the slow accumulation of decades that transforms young lovers into an old married couple who have weathered a lifetime together, Graham never stopped being grateful for the improbable chain of events that had brought Florence Redmond into his life on that fateful noon stage so many years before. On their 40th wedding anniversary, in October of 1918, with the whole extended family gathered together, children and grandchildren filling the house Graham had built beyond its original capacity, requiring tables to be set up outside despite the cool autumn air, Graham stood to offer a toast that had, by tradition, become expected at every significant anniversary celebration through the years. 40 years ago, he said, raising his glass toward his wife, who sat beside him with their eldest grandchild, Thomas's daughter Eleanor, perched on her lap. I mocked the very idea of a mail-order bride at my breakfast table, certain that such an arrangement could never lead to genuine happiness. By supper that same evening, I had met the woman who would prove me entirely wrong, and who has spent every day since teaching me exactly how foolish my certainties truly were. The gathered family laughed at this familiar retelling, having heard some version of this story at nearly every family gathering for the past 4 decades. But Graham noticed, as he always did, that Florence's eyes still grew bright with emotion at these words, even after so many years, even after they had built an entire lifetime together from that improbable beginning. "I have built a great many things in my life," Graham continued, his voice growing rougher with emotion despite his years of practice at this particular toast. "Horseshoes and hinges, and the very foundation of the church where we were married, the house we raised our children in, the business that has supported 3 generations of our family now. But the finest thing I ever built, the thing I am most proud of in all my years, is the life I have shared with Florence Redmond Ellsworth, built patiently, hammer stroke by hammer stroke, stitch by careful stitch, through 40 years of joy and hardship and everything in between. I love you, Florence, as much today as I did that evening beside the creek when I first asked to court you properly, and I intend to keep loving you for however many years Providence sees fit to grant us yet." Florence, her own eyes bright with tears now, rose from her seat despite Eleanor's protests at being displaced from her lap, and crossed to where Graham stood, taking his weathered hands in her own equally weathered ones. 40 years of shared labor and shared love visible in the lines and calluses of both. "Graham Ellsworth," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered family despite its softness, "I stepped off that stagecoach 40 years ago believing in a fiction, a collection of pretty words written by a man who had never truly existed. What I found instead was infinitely better than any letter could have promised. A man of genuine character and unwavering devotion, who built me a home and a family, and a lifetime of love I could not have imagined possible during those darkest days after my father's death, when I believed myself entirely alone in the world with nowhere left to turn. You saved me that day, Graham, though you have always insisted it was Sam's foolishness that deserves the credit. But I know the truth of it. It was your kindness, your integrity, your willingness to take responsibility for a mess you did not create, that saved me, and that has continued to save me and to love me every single day since." The whole gathered family had grown quiet during this exchange, even the youngest grandchildren sensing the weight and tenderness of the moment. And when Florence finally leaned in to kiss her husband of 40 years, the assembled family erupted into applause and cheering much as their wedding guests had done 4 decades earlier in the small church at the edge of town. Sam Whitfield, present at this celebration as he had been present at nearly every significant moment in Graham and Florence's shared life, called out from his own seat, considerably more gray-haired now than the young feed store owner who had once caused such chaos with his misguided scheme. "I still say I deserve some credit in all this," he called out, to general laughter from the family, "seeing as none of it would have happened without my meddling." "You will get your credit at the next anniversary, Sam, same as every year before," Graham called back, laughing, "though I still maintain you deserved a proper thrashing for how you went about it." "A small price to pay," Sam said, raising his own glass, "for 40 years of the finest friendship and the happiest marriage I have ever had the privilege to witness." As the celebration continued into the evening, lanterns lit against the gathering autumn darkness much as they had been lit at Graham and Florence's own wedding celebration 40 years before. Graham found a quiet moment to slip away with Florence toward the edge of the property, where they could look out over the land they had built their life upon, the mountains rising dark and familiar against the star-filled sky, the same mountains that had watched over every joy and hardship of their shared history. "Do you have any regrets?" Florence asked him quietly as they stood together in the cool evening air, her hand finding his the way it always did, the way it had found his that first evening beside the creek so many years before. Graham considered the question seriously, as he always considered anything Florence asked of him, weighing the full weight of 4 decades of shared life before answering. "Only one," he said finally. "I regret that I mocked the idea so thoroughly that morning, before I understood what it would bring me. I wish I could go back and tell that foolish younger version of myself that he was about to receive the greatest gift of his entire life, and that he ought to be more grateful and less arrogant about matters he did not yet understand." Florence laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as they had done countless times through the years, watching the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their improbable love story. "I think," she said, "that perhaps some gifts are only fully appreciated when they arrive unexpectedly, disguised as chaos and embarrassment on a dusty street corner. Perhaps if you had known what was coming, you would not have appreciated it half so much when it actually arrived." "Perhaps," Graham agreed, wrapping his arm around her and pulling her close against the growing chill of the autumn evening. "Though I think I have spent every day since appreciating it fully, Florence, exactly as much as it deserves." "And how much is that?" she asked, smiling up at him in the starlight. "More than all the iron I have ever shaped, more than every hinge and horseshoe and tool that has passed through my hands in this lifetime. More than I have words to properly express, though I have spent 40 years trying to find them anyway, at every anniversary, at every quiet evening on this porch, at every moment I have had the privilege of loving you." They stood together in silence after that, needing no further words, 40 years of shared history speaking more eloquently than anything either of them could have said aloud. And behind them, the sounds of their children and grandchildren, their extended family and closest friends, celebrating the improbable beginning that had led to this rich and abundant life, drifted across the cool October air like a benediction. Like proof that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with careful planning and certain knowledge, but with chaos and mockery, and a woman stepping off a noon stage with nothing but a carpet bag, and an unshakable determination to build a life worth living, regardless of how improperly that life happened to begin. Graham Ellsworth had mocked the idea of a mail-order bride at breakfast one spring morning in 1878, certain in his bachelor wisdom that such arrangements could never lead to genuine happiness. He could not have known, as he laughed at Sam Whitfield's foolish scheme over eggs and coffee, that by supper that very evening he would meet the woman who would become his wife, the mother of his children, the partner in building a lifetime of love that would prove every one of his certainties gloriously, wonderfully wrong. 40 years later, standing beneath the same Wyoming stars that had witnessed every joy and hardship of their shared history, surrounded by the family they had built together from that improbable beginning, Graham understood finally and completely that love did not always announce itself through careful courtship and certain knowledge. Sometimes it arrived on a dusty stagecoach at noon, disguised as chaos and misunderstanding, and revealed itself only through the patient, deliberate choice two people made, day after day, year after year, to build something lasting from whatever unlikely foundation fate had provided them. That Graham had come to understand was the truest kind of love there was, the kind that grew not from perfect beginnings, but from the steady, hammer-stroke patience of two hearts choosing each other, again and again, for a lifetime.